Hello there, pipe smokers of Ireland, lads and lasses. This is the Pipepastor coming to you once again, and closing out our series on masculine virtue today. And I want to thank you for many encouraging remarks that you have sent me in comments. Been so kind, and I appreciate it. I don't know what the weather is where you're at, but these last, 5 or 6 days, it's been uncharacteristically warm here in California. We've been hanging around 60 degrees, and right in the heart of winter. I'm smoking today another Mark Balkovic pipe that Mark made for me, and it's a cutty and unusual rustication. Very nice. The first pipe I had that looked like this was a Tom Eltang, and Tom's was a good pipe, very expensive, and but the draw wasn't that good, and the stem was a little bit hard to clench. Mark, I think, took Tom's design to a whole new level, and I think he absolutely nailed it, and it's a much better pipe. It's a little pipe, not that big, acrylic stem, but oh, what a smoker. Just beautiful. And cutties used to be my favorite shape. I like cutties, still do. And every once in a while, when I have a Canadian made, sometimes I'll have the bowl canted off at an angle, which is what they call canted, like a cutty. I like it. Love this pipe. Oh, and I'm smoking a most delicious bowl full of Black Gold Plus, which again is black Cavendish with a mixture of Virginias in it. The cousin to my favorite tobacco, Black Gold. Very nice. Delicious. Just got through seeing The Hobbit for the second time. The War of the Five Armies, and I just loved it. Really, really enjoyed that last of the series. I ain't gonna cry. I ain't gonna lie. I'm a weeper. I wept. I cried like a baby, like a girl, at some of the scenes in there. But really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. And if you haven't seen it yet, you need to see it. It's good stuff. And it's tough to see those things go. I'm almost certain someone's going to try to make a couple of movies that are gaps in between the story somehow, some way. I just don't see how they're going to let this die. I'll tell you what, I don't envy the guy that has to try to make a remake of The Hobbit anytime soon, that's for sure, or The Lord of the Rings. So, anyway, how you guys doing? What are you up to? This is, by the way, for those of you that just saw Tom Kirkbright's resident video last week of his favorite place to smoke, which I mean, he's got a balcony that's It's just a great place, looking out over the historic parts of his city. And Tom is just so doggone friendly and honest and real, and he's got that great Irish accent. I wish I had one. Now, I'm going to bring Brian on one of these days. Brian is one of my young men here at the church who took a trip to Ireland and toured it and came back with the Irish accent down. And I'll have him try it out to see what Keir and what Tom and the rest of you guys think. You know what I'd like Tom, I'd like you or Keir, some of you guys in Ireland, to make fun of an American accent. I'd like to hear what you guys hear when you make fun of that. But if I had my dream in the whole world, I'd like to either have a Scottish or an Irish accent. Just you sound so much smarter when you got a Irish or a Scottish accent, I think. You just sound more intelligent, more theological. And I'd try to do it for you right now, but it's just awful. But young Brian Majors has got it down. In any case, we're talking about masculine virtue. And the myth that women are inherently virtuous and men are inherently not. And kind of explained that last week pretty good. So I won't bore you with saying that again, but I want to talk today about virtue and about the Code of Chivalry. And I want to broach the subject of the ideal man. Is there a characteristic or characteristics that make up manhood in its ideal state? And conversations about this, by the way, have been called the eternal conversation, or the everlasting conversation, because in every era, in every tribe, clan, there are groups of men that have gotten together in a pub over a beer, what have you, and talked about the characteristics of an ideal man. And of course, some cultures are different in some of their characteristics, but by and large, there are certain characteristics that emerge in every culture about what that culture expects out of the men and the boys that make up that culture. And it's the characteristics of the ideal man. But before I talk about that, let me talk about virtue. Virtue is a man thing. Believe it or not. The first discussions of virtue and morality were built around the idea of the ideal man and the ideal woman. Words have the habit of evolving new meanings over time, particularly if they come from older languages like the Greek or the Greco-Roman language or the Latin language. But a careful look at the evolution of words can give us insight into the cultures that created those words and then later altered them. For example, in the strictest and the oldest sense of the word, women were not looked on as inherently virtuous. In fact, the modern word virtue itself comes from a Latin word, virtus, which means manliness, and it comes from a root word for man, which is vir or vir, means man. Virtus, V-I-R-T-U-S, means manliness. So virtue as a word is a masculine term pointing toward masculine uh, characteristics, honorable, moral, virtuous, chivalric characteristics. Now, the Code of Chivalry, I'm sure you heard of that. And the Code of Chivalry was created by Christianity. It was the Christian church's way of trying to civilize the non-combatant behavior of knights. Because at a time, knights were anything but sterling. They were anything but the knight in shining armor. They were barbaric, unmannerly, uncouth, filthy. They were trained for one thing, and that's to fight and kill things, break things. And they did not know how to live in civility. They were barbaric, especially in the way that they talked to and treated women. And so the church originally, in looking upon Christ, saw in Jesus the vision of an ideal man. Over time, that's been softened until today. Christ has been largely feminized in our societies. But Jesus is the epitome of a real man, and he is not just all tender and merciful and loving. Sometimes he has been known to weep a little bit, and other times to whip a little bit. He wept some, and he wept some. He wept some and he whipped some. There were times when he made a whip and cleared out all the thugs in a religious center of establishment called the temple, and none of them challenged him. There were times when he was anything but kind in his remarks toward people that were beaten up on his disciples and other people, as far as verbally and religiously. Jesus was not the kind of man you wanted to mess with and push over the edge, because, basically you can get your ass whipped. And so the church, seeing the ideal qualities of what I have come to call, and I borrowed these from Anvelin in his book Steel and Velvet. Steel and Velvet is what I call them, characteristics, and use them to civilize the otherwise barbaric knight. So the Code of Chivalry is a Christian invention. And C.S. Lewis once remarked that men need artificial equipment to be civil, that it is not part of our nature, or women as well, to be moral on our own, that we need a code that's outside or outboard equipment, something outside of ourselves that calls us, or calls the virtuous man out of us, and points us in an accountable direction on how to live. And the Code of Chivalry identified 7 characteristics in counter-distinction toward one another. Actually, 14 characteristics in counter-distinction to one another, and 7 of them were called the 7 virtues, and 7 were called the 7 vices. Each vice had its counterpart or opposite. And so, starting with the first vice, or the worst vice, if you will, pride. Pride was the vice of having too high an opinion or too high an estimation of oneself. St. Augustine said that pride was the love of one's own excellence. And the the counterpart to the vice of pride was the virtue of humility or lowliness. And this was basically having an appropriate or um, accurate estimation of yourself by first having an accurate estimation of God, which is reverence, and then having an accurate estimation of others, which was courtesy, and then having an accurate estimation of yourself, which is humility. Seeing oneself as a servant. We train our kids at the man maker camps and men at the man camps, which we will have again this year. And I'll be letting you guys know about it, any of you guys that want to try to make a trip and come to it. We say to them that a real man understands that he has been born to serve others, not to be subservient necessarily, but to see himself as here for other people. That we're here for others. And a counterfeit man is here just to serve himself. Following the vice of pride is the vice of greed. And greed is always wanting more because you think you owe yourself more. It's a getting instead of giving. And the counterpart to the vice of greed is the virtue of generosity or largesse, which is giving gladly and liberally without begrudging, being merciful, experiencing great joy in the giving to others. The next vice, the third vice, is lust, which is unrestrained or unchecked and undisciplined sexual desire. And lust coincided with leer. Where there's lust, there's leer, and where there's leering, there's lusting. And the virtue that's the counterpart to lust is chastity, which is self-restraint, an intentional sexual purity of heart through the valuing of God's word and disciplining one's eyes not to leer and one's heart not to lust. In the book of Job, chapter 31, about the first 7 verses, is an excellent passage of scripture, which Job begins by saying, I have made a covenant or a contract with my eyes not to look upon the daughters of men with lust in my heart. And so we do this with men and boys here. We say that it's not possible for a young man or a man to never feel or have lust in their hearts. And so it's not that we're trying to exorcise lust from our hearts, but that we look at lust as something to manage and keep in check until its rightful expression. Same with anger. The fourth vice is anger, which is unrestrained justice, which turns to vengeance or revenge. It's the unbridled frustration and bitterness and jealousy that finds its expression in eliminating that which makes it feel diminished. And believe it or not, the counterpart to the vice of anger is the virtue of patience or meekness. Patience or meekness means basically strength under control. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is strength under control. Picture a stallion, for instance, that's trusted by its master. As the master gets down and gets underneath that stallion to check on its horseshoes to see if it's okay, the stallion will not move. It stays in place. He could easily trample its owner if he wanted to, but that stallion has allowed itself to come under the control of another person. We always ask a man a very important question that every man needs to answer. Who's your authority? Who is your authority? Who is it that you submit to? Who is it that you're accountable to? Who's higher than yourself? Ultimately, that should be God. No man dies for his country. When they're in the fit of war and life and death is in the struggle, those men will die for their commanding officer. Somebody tangible, somebody that is their authority. Who's your authority? Then the fifth vice is gluttony. Unrestrained appetite, self-gratification, instant or over-gratification. And the virtue that counteracts that is temperance, which is abstinence, fasting at times, moderation in all things, self-restraint, discipline, or self-discipline. The sixth vice is envy, and envy is basically entitlement, whereas greed says, I owe me, envy says, God owes me, and I should have this or that, I deserve this or that more than you do, and if you've got it and I don't have it, I feel that that's wrong, it's unjust, and I envy it. Envy is seeing the harm of the person that has what it wants as just. And the virtue that counteracts that is courtesy. And courtesy is the desire to see others blessed, joy in the good fortunes of others. Courtesy has been called fellow feeling. Courtesy basically asks the question of what can I do so that my friend, my guest, my neighbor feels no discomfort? What can I do to bless them, to serve them, to give them enjoyment? Courtesy. And C.S. Lewis said that courtesy is one of the crowning virtues. And then seventh is sloth, the vice of sloth, which is cowardice, lack of martial prowess, believe it or not just not working, but that you do not practice being martial, whether that's practicing shooting your gun or whether it's practicing fighting, but being prepared in the moment to be able to defend the poor, to defend the weak, the elderly, the children. To be unprepared to do so is considered sloth. It's the love of pleasure or the love of life over the love of what is right and excellent. It's, as I said, unpreparedness. It's lacking a transcendent cause that's higher than just living for yourself and self-preservation. Someone who's not slothful has courage, and courage is the love for what is right, the care and the value for the weak. It's value for prowess. Courage is the recognition of good and evil, and that living in peace with all men is artificial, it is not natural, and therefore cannot be sustained for very long before it needs to be defended. Therefore, a courageous man has prepared beforehand to lay down his life if necessary to defend the common peace. Got a new lighter. Awesome. Do you have a transcendent cause? something that transcends your own self, or just your temporal or proximate goods? I'd like to know what it is. Now, there is such a thing, as I said, as the ideal man, the authentic man, or authentic masculinity, that defines a general comprehensive definition of what it means to be a virtuous and moral man. And this code of virtue, or what we would call virtuous masculinity, contains some of the same expectations in every culture, including these 7. The standing up for danger. The ideal man will stand up to danger. He will bear up under pain and suffering. He will sacrifice himself for the good of others. He will be ferocious in battle. He will be generous and merciful. He will be faithful and have integrity in the keeping of his word without negotiation. And 7th, he'll have a strong faith in his God, which undergirds all of the above, and from which all the above come. The code of virtue, or chivalry, or authentic masculinity, is meant to help men to overcome their natural instincts, which seek to compel him to live for himself or be self-serving, rather than to be fulfilled in his manhood by serving others, protecting others. Where there is the ideal of the virtuous man, there is also the counterfeit man. And in the days when men strove to live by Code of Chivalry, there was only 2 good reasons, or main reasons, for a man to risk his life. And the first was that he would risk his life for honor. That is, he would risk his life to uphold his integrity, or the integrity of his name, his fidelity, his faith. And the second was empathy, or compassion and kindness. These are the 2 most basic and necessary of the manly virtues, and society should be glad for them. Just ask the women and children aboard the Titanic if they were thankful for the Code of Chivalry. Now, here's a couple of questions you might be able to ask yourself as I close today. How has your ability to envision your own masculinity and live according to the code of masculine virtue been negatively impacted in your life? We go back to what we said before. A man will be the man he sees. In this case, I couldn't look to my dad, but I could look to my grandfathers and on to see that vision. Secondly, how have men and boys been propagandized regarding their gender? In what specific ways has this propaganda affected their behavior in different areas? And then thirdly, I don't know if you guys read the Bible or not, but there's a book called 2 Samuel, and in chapter 10:12, it elicits a strange phrase. The phrase is "play the man." It goes like this: "Be of good courage, and let us play the man for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." And this phrase, "play the man," was what the general Joab said to his brother Abishai when they were completely surrounded by Syrians and Ammonites. The Apostle Paul said it like this: "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." So Joab and Paul assumed that they were addressing an understood code of how a masculine, virtuous man should behave under stress. What does play the man and what does act like a man mean to you in the light of what you've been hearing me say, or in the light of what you've been hearing in your own life? And then lastly, what would you like to be addressed in the future in regard to helping you be the best possible man. There's steel and there's velvet characteristics, soft and hard. We should all strive to be an ideal man that has married both together to be the best possible man he could be in this life. This is the Pipe Pastor. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.